Good day, everybody, and thank you for coming to this Jewish Quarterly Review session at the 2020 AJS. My name is Natalie Dohrmann, and I am co-editor along with David Myers of the Jewish Quarterly Review. Today, I am so pleased to welcome you all to celebrate the 130th anniversary of the original publication of JQR. We are the longest running English language journal of its kind, and our history is inseparable from the history of Anglophone Jewish studies, especially in the United States. The AJS has given us 15 minutes to mark the occasion, which by my math is a little under 7 seconds a year. And we have invited three wonderful scholars and colleagues, each a member of JQR's editorial board, to help us think about what the history of Jewish studies has to tell us about its future, to discuss archives, venerating and disrupting the past, and how journals can play a role in shaking up the academic status quo. Let me introduce my conversation partners. First, Irene Zwiep. Irene is professor of Hebrew and Jewish studies at the University of Amsterdam. Elisheva Baumgarten is Professor Yitzhak Becker Chair of Jewish Studies in the Departments of Jewish History and History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Jessica Marglin, Associate Professor of Religion and Law and the Ruth Ziegler Early Career Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Southern California. Each is a formidable and fearless scholar with capacious interests in their research areas, but each as well is invested deeply in the broader history of Jewish studies and the current workings of the discipline as a whole. A warm welcome to all three of you. The journal chose to mark its anniversary by asking 6 prominent scholars to dive into the riches of a century and a third's worth of JQR's archives, to select an essay that inspired them, for any reason at all, for its foresight or its folly, its impact or its neglect, for its virtues or its sins. And we asked them to use that essay as a lens through which to view the field today. The exercise generated a lively conversation, which is findable in our fall issue, and includes terrific interventions also by Ben Summer, Jonathan Dechter, and Eve Krakowski, as well as our 3 panelists. Let me open the discussion with a question about how we use and abuse our scholarly past. As a guild, we're in the habit of attributing to the past practitioners of our fields either the status of giants to be heaped with praise, or as benighted provincials to be patronized and dismissed, and often both in the same breath. But exploring JQR's archives yielded inverse results to our scholars. In short, the fin de siècle scholars of Jewish studies were seen to be at once less giant-like and more modern than we expected. What for each of you was the takeaway from this exercise? On how we think about our fields, on how we do our work, and on how we train our students. Let me start with you, Irene.
Well, I think I would like to answer this in a very personal way. When I joined the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies as a student in the 1980s, the field was still very much dominated by Christian theology and especially by New Testament studies. And my latest supervisor, my PhD supervisor, he was somebody who very tacitly and very unemphatically distanced himself from that. And that left me in a kind of a vacuum. So on the one hand, I loved him and I still love him for having done that, for emancipating the field from theology. But there was very little of a larger conversation in return. And in order to join any conversation, what I did was study Wissenschaft des Judentums. So the guys of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, giant-like and benighted though they were, they are my actual teachers. They are the ones who taught me not just to do scholarship on Jewish sources, but to actually join a Jewish conversation, which the Amsterdam environment at that time could not offer me. It not necessarily didn't want to offer it to me, but it couldn't. And for me, that makes it very clear that giants are there for a reason. They are there because we need a kind of a Shalshelet Kabbalah, a kind of scholarly continuum for the humanities, maybe not just necessarily for Jewish studies, but for the humanities per se, because I think that this continuous, well, like the Torah, the Torat Moshe Sinai, it's this continuum that is important, I would say also to society, that is there. It's good for the, I hate the biological metaphor, but for the mental and the intellectual hygiene of society, it's good to have this shalshelet, and I gladly position myself in them. And when training my students, I try to make them aware that they have their own position to find in that shalshelet. I notice that my own PhDs, and I have 9, each of them thinks they will be in academia. None of them thinks they will be doing Jewish studies in an emphatically Jewish studies way, and I let them, but they still should feel, and I think they do, feel part of that Shalshelet HaKabbalah that, well, that I think is very beneficial to society. It's very quick and a lot to say, but that would be my take on this, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Elisheva, your thoughts?
Thank you. Maybe I'll take a little bit of a different approach than the one Irene just took. And I'll say that when I discovered that, when I look back at what was written a century ago, I discovered that all the sources that I'm familiar with today, or almost all the sources, were well known to the giant I was writing about, that was Solomon Schechter. At the same time, I discovered that the way he wrote about those sources and the questions he was asking were in many ways so different from the questions I would ask today, or certainly from the way I would phrase the questions and the angles I would try to get at by asking those questions. And to me, when I do my work, and also for my students, I always go back to these giants for 2 reasons. First of all, because they knew so much. And they knew so much, and we want to make sure that we know everything they did. And sometimes it's a way to check yourself and to make sure you're on the right track, you're reading the right sources, you're getting to the right places. It should teach you also some humility. You should know that you're not the first person looking at these sources. You're not the person who will say, my manuscript or my book says this. Someone else saw it before you. But at the same time, it should also give you an awareness that you're working from the society you live in. And the questions you're asking are particular to you and to the places and the thoughts and the ideas that you're trained with. And that will, on the one hand, give a value to what you're doing, and at the same time also let you understand the relativity of the value of what you're doing at that time. So I think they're really a good place for us to check ourselves and to give ourselves the freedom to ask the questions.
Thank you. Jessica.
I will also go off of what Elisheva said, because I was also going to speak about humility. You sort of anticipated my main contribution, which was precisely that I think, as a scholar, you're always trying to walk that fine line between believing enough in the worth of what you have to say that is innovative and different and distinctive and worth the paper that it's printed on, and the humility of knowing that nobody ever is writing in a vacuum and that you're in the midst of a conversation. And, I'll quote Kamala Harris, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants at some level, right? None of the work that we do would ever be possible without the people who worked before us. And I think that maybe in my field, it's a little different actually in terms of the sort of, the kinds of things that one reads in the 19th century, because actually the sources have changed quite a bit, especially for the history of the modern Middle East, which, the history of Jews in the modern Middle East, which essentially wasn't really a topic of much interest for, not the history, maybe the anthropology a little bit, the ethnography a little bit, but the history of the Jews in the modern Middle East was not a very kind of strong research interest at the turn of the century. And one of the things that's fun about that research area that makes me love it is that there are all of these untapped archives out there that are just waiting, really like new sources that basically nobody has seen or that people have only seen once or twice. And that I think also poses a particular kind of challenge, because that really makes you, that's a huge sort of temptation for hubris, because if you're finding a new archive or a new source, of course you're going to revolutionize the way we think about history. But I think what I found in reading the archives of JQR, as it were, the early issues of JQR, is that even if the sources have changed radically, and even if the sort of subjects have changed, the big questions, the big human questions of history really maybe haven't changed so much, right? The extent to which Jews assimilate or do not, the extent to which Judaism is shaped by the societies in which it lives versus the sort of internal logic of Jewishness. These are, and many others obviously, but these are questions that we've been asking maybe since there was, Judaism. And that I think also is a call to humility, that we're not going to come up with the definitive answers, but of course, in every generation, we must ask the question.
How do we embrace a kind of intellectual's nuance, not as a weakness, but as a strength, even though in this climate especially, it will put us at political risk to do so to a certain extent? How do we keep our fields intellectually courageous, agile?
It may seem maybe too simple, but perhaps it's the elegance and the simplicity of the answer to this great question of what is the humanities about anymore when everybody cares about career and, you know, STEM and all of that. I think it is about that nuance and that complexity and holding that as a value, right? Not just critical thinking or a tool, but actually something that we need to strive for, to see in every context and every situation. And I completely agree that it is lost on all shades of the political spectrum. And I think it's something that intellectuals can do for society. I mean, Irene was talking about what we owe to society. And I think that's one of the other ways in which we can contribute, is to push for nuance and to push for complexity.
Thank you. Elisheva.
So maybe I'll say that as a historian, looking back at the people who I study in the past, and I'm particularly interested in those who didn't leave us those answers written down, that we have to seek them out in other ways, I would look at that nuance or that complexity from a different perspective, or from an additional perspective. I agree with what Jessica said, of course, and to say that it's important to me that when we study the past, we realize that those people are as complex as we are.
In your essays, in many ways, saw the political commitments of the scholars you were looking at. They were plain to see, and yet it didn't in many cases occlude the value of the research done, or did it? And so if we can add that as well. Irene, your thoughts?
Can I maybe also tie in a bit with what our fellow speakers just raised? One of the things that we're struggling with right now in, well, at least in the Netherlands, but maybe also in Europe, is not so much a political thing. It's that the humanities are sort of losing touch with their potential audience. So I think that what I notice is that we very much want to contribute to nuance, to understandings of complexity. But I sometimes feel that the audience that we should be talking to is actually going like this. And in Europe, it's perhaps, well, already also very much noticeable in the funding of research.
And I do think that there is something we can learn actually from these JQR articles, which has to do with, you know, a little bit of the burden on us as scholars. I mean, I think that there's a range of different kinds of scholarship, and you know, by no means do I think all scholarship needs to be sort of accessible to a broader public, but I do think that there is a way in which the prose of those early JQR articles is lucid and accessible and clear and jargon-free. And I think that there's something to be learned from that, a return to a way of talking about scholarship that any reasonably, you know, intelligent and with a sort of some kind of base level of education person can pick up and engage with.
Well, I cannot thank the three of you enough. This really makes it worth it for me, being around brilliant people who are unafraid to, you know, embrace warmly their students, to push new ideas out there, to think broadly. It really is thrilling. And I also, you know, every time I go back to JQR, like the three of you, I'm deeply humbled by not only the stature of the incredible learning, just to see the riches that we of the soil that we grow from. It's just a wonderful experiment every time. So on behalf of the editorial team at JQR, and to this I want to put a nod out not only to David and myself, but also our managing editor, Ann Albert, and the tireless Bonnie Blankenship. We're really thrilled you joined us. We're thrilled you're part of our team, as well as the editorial board and participating in our forum. Thank you so much.